They told me to sit on the floor.
My own son, with his clipped, irritated voice, the one he uses when he believes I am too slow to follow instructions, turned his head just slightly toward me at the train station and said those words that still ring in my ears like a command meant for an unwanted pet. "Sit on the floor, Mom. There aren't any seats." He didn't even lower his voice out of shame. He said it plainly, almost carelessly, as though there were nothing strange about ordering an old woman, his mother, the very person who had once held him up by the arms when his legs were too weak to stand, to fold herself down onto the hard station tiles among suitcases and discarded wrappers. I remember that my knees, stiff with arthritis and swollen from the walk across the platform, resisted immediately. But I obeyed anyway, because that is what I have always done. Obey my son, obey my family, swallow my discomfort, and behave as though gratitude alone should keep me silent. I am 78 now, and I live alone in a modest apartment that overlooks the station tracks. So every evening when I hear the whistle of the evening trains pulling out into the dark, I think of that moment when I let my body sink to the floor, like a bag someone has dropped in a hurry, and I wonder why it hurt more than all the other humiliations that came before. The station was crowded that morning, the kind of crowd that moves in clumps and waves, children whining, vendors calling out the price of sandwiches, the acrid smell of diesel mingling with coffee and wet coats. But in all that noise, I felt singled out, as though a spotlight had been thrown on me, the bent old woman in a faded coat being told to crouch at the feet of her family. There were benches along the wall, but they were filled with strangers. Young men slouched with headphones, mothers nursing babies, teenagers scrolling through their phones. And though any one of them could have looked up and seen my hesitation, no one moved. No one offered space. My daughter-in-law was already shepherding the children toward the ticket gate, her phone in hand, her eyes darting between screens. And she didn't pause to ask if I was comfortable. She didn't even glance back. My son was carrying the heavy suitcase, the new black one I had actually paid for, with part of my pension as a birthday gift. And he looked annoyed that I had not immediately followed his instructions. I lowered myself onto the tiles, clutching my small handbag to my chest, and felt the cold seeping into my bones like water into cracked stone. The station floor smelled of iron and dust and something faintly sour, and in that moment I realized that even the smell of a place could be cruel if it met you at the wrong time. I should have resisted. I should have said, "No, I will not sit there. I am your mother. Find me a seat." But I didn't. I lowered myself slowly, trembling from both pain and embarrassment, and sat where he told me, shrinking into myself so that the strangers brushing past would not stumble over my outstretched legs. I told myself it would only be for a few minutes, that soon the train would arrive, that once inside, I could rest. That is how I consoled myself, repeating that it was temporary, that my humiliation had an end point. But in truth, there was something bottomless in that moment. A quiet recognition that once a child gives his mother the floor, she will never be offered the chair again. He did not mean it as a declaration, I am sure, but it was one nonetheless. I remember looking up at the advertisements above the ticket counters, glossy posters of beaches and smiling families holding ice cream cones, and feeling a pang of irony so sharp I almost laughed. There they were, these manufactured images of happiness, and there I was, the reality that never makes it onto the posters, an old woman whose usefulness has expired, whose presence is tolerated but not cherished, a body that must be moved out of the way when space is scarce. It wasn't just that my son told me to sit. It was that he spoke with that thin impatience that suggested my existence was a problem to be managed quickly, like a spilled drink or a missing ticket stub. I sat there longer than I realized, perhaps half an hour, watching people stream past, measuring the rhythm of the station through the movement of shoes, polished boots, sneakers, heels clicking against the floor. 1,000 lives passing inches from my face while I remained rooted to the ground. Some looked at me briefly and turned away. Others never noticed. Once, a child pointed and whispered something to his mother, who tugged his arm and hurried on. I felt like a cautionary figure in a parable. This is what happens when you outlive your usefulness. I thought of the times I had carried my son on my lap during long train rides when he was small, the way I had balanced his head against my chest so he could sleep while I endured the stiff seats and the endless sway of the carriage. Not once did I consider my discomfort then. It did not even cross my mind. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him safe. That was the duty of a mother. And now, when the roles should have reversed, when it was his turn to ensure my dignity, he had commanded me to fold myself down into the dirt and the drafts without a second thought. I live alone now, in that modest apartment by the tracks, and perhaps it is fitting, because every whistle and every rumble of wheels across the rails reminds me that life is nothing but departures. People leave you in ways large and small, first by running off to play without looking back, then by moving to another city, then by asking you to watch their children so they can travel without you, and finally by treating you as though you are a cumbersome parcel to be shifted aside. I have learned that abandonment is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet, almost polite, dressed in ordinary phrases like, "Sit on the floor, Mom." Yet it wounds more deeply than the loud betrayals, because it is casual, because it is said without thought, because it reveals the truth without disguise. You are no longer seen as someone deserving of care, only as someone taking up space. I remember that morning as if it happened yesterday. The station clock ticked loudly overhead, its hands moving in jerks as if time itself were impatient with me, and the announcements crackled about delays and departures. My legs tingled from lack of circulation. But I stayed there, afraid that standing would draw more attention, afraid that if I rose, someone would see how stiffly I moved and laugh at my clumsy body. I thought of all the times I had taken my son on journeys, school trips, vacations, funerals, and how I had always been the one to pack the sandwiches, to count the tickets twice, to keep him warm with my coat when he forgot his own. And now, with roles reversed, he did not offer me his arm or his seat. He told me to sit on the floor. That was the introduction to this chapter of my life, and I know now that it was more than a moment. It was a declaration of how he saw me, and how I had to choose whether I would continue to see myself that way as well. The defining moment came not with a shout or an argument, but with the soft, matter-of-fact tone of the conductor who bent down toward me as I sat on that cold floor, his uniform crisp, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of quiet authority that could not be argued with, and he asked, almost gently, if I would follow him. At first I thought he must be speaking to someone else, some other passenger who had dropped a ticket or lost their way, because it had been so long since a stranger had spoken to me with genuine regard that my ears refused to believe it was meant for me. But then his hand gestured directly, his eyes met mine, and I understood that he was addressing the old woman on the tiles. My son barely noticed, too absorbed in corralling his children and negotiating with his wife about where to put the strollers and bags. And for a moment, I considered refusing out of misplaced loyalty, as if following the conductor's invitation would embarrass my son or expose him as negligent. But then something in the man's gaze, steady, expectant, neither pitying nor hurried, gave me the courage to shift my aching body and accept his arm. The train had arrived with its groan of metal and sigh of steam, passengers streaming toward the carriages in a messy flow, and as I let the conductor lead me away from the cluster of my family, I felt a peculiar mixture of shame and relief. Shame that I needed rescuing in the first place, and relief that someone, anyone, saw me as worth rescuing at all. He guided me toward the first-class carriage, its doors glinting with polished brass, its windows clearer, and when he ushered me inside, the difference struck me instantly. The smell was cleaner, the air warmer, the seats broader, upholstered in a dark blue fabric that promised comfort rather than punishment. He motioned for me to sit, and I sank into the chair as though my bones themselves were sighing, and in that instant I realized how long it had been since I had been given a place of dignity rather than a corner, a bench edge, or a floor. He asked if I needed tea, and when I nodded, still too startled to speak, he disappeared and returned with a small white cup that steamed gently in my hands, its heat seeping into my stiff fingers like an apology I had been waiting decades to hear. Meanwhile, my son and his family boarded a few carriages down, and I could see them only briefly through the window as they bustled with their luggage, unaware or perhaps unconcerned about where I had gone. I imagined the conversation they might be having, my daughter-in-law complaining about delays, the children squabbling over window seats, my son distracted, and I wondered if at any point he realized that his mother was no longer with them, that she had been separated, not forcibly, but by the simple act of kindness from a stranger that highlighted his own indifference. I cannot say whether he cared. What I do know is that he did not come looking for me, not once during the journey. And when later he finally noticed I was not seated behind them, he simply assumed I must be somewhere else on the train and left it at that. As the train began to move, carrying us away from the station, I sat in that cushioned seat and looked out the window, my reflection faint against the blur of countryside, and thought about what had just happened. A man who did not know me, who had no stake in my life, had seen my humiliation and decided it was unacceptable. He had acted without fanfare, without speeches, simply offering me the dignity my own family withheld. That was the catalyst, the pivot point, the moment that cracked something open inside me. Because once you experience the taste of dignity after years of swallowing indignity, it becomes impossible to pretend you do not know the difference. I sipped the tea, bitter but strong, and I thought of all the times I had accepted less respect, less patience, less space, less love. It was not always obvious, not always cruel in appearance, but it was steady, cumulative, a lifetime of being edged out of the center of the circle and told to be grateful for the crumbs at the margin. I thought back to when my son was a boy, when we took a train to visit my sister in another city, and how he had fallen asleep in my lap while I stayed awake to make sure no stranger brushed against him too roughly. And I remembered how heavy his head had been, how my arms ached, but I never shifted because I didn't want to disturb him. That was love, and I never questioned it. Now, decades later, he did not even think to offer me his seat, did not notice the pain etched into my posture, did not recognize the insult embedded in his casual command. And yet a stranger, a conductor with dozens of passengers to manage, had taken a moment to see me, to say with his action alone, "You deserve to sit here, not there." That realization was not just comforting. It was devastating, because it showed me, with cruel clarity, that my son's treatment of me was not inevitable, not a universal law of aging, but a choice he had made. Others could choose differently. As the countryside flickered past, I held on to that cup of tea as though it were a relic, a token of a new possibility. I told myself that I should not read too much into it, that it was merely a small gesture of kindness, but inside, I knew it was more. It was a crack in the narrative I had been forced to live by, the story that said, an old woman must accept invisibility, must accept humiliation, must shrink until she fits into whatever corner is allotted. The conductor had not offered me charity. He had offered me recognition, and that recognition lit a flame I had nearly forgotten could exist. The journey itself passed in a blur, not because it was uneventful, but because my mind was busy replaying the scene again and again. My son's voice, my body folding down, the conductor's hand reaching out, the difference between neglect and respect, illustrated in the space of 10 minutes. I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I had been lifted out of degradation. Heavier because I now carried the knowledge that my son's carelessness was not born of necessity, but of disregard. I sat very still, the rhythm of the train rocking me gently, and promised myself, though I did not yet know what form it would take, that I would not forget this lesson. A stranger had seen me. A stranger had cared. And if a stranger could do it, then surely I could begin to see myself again, not as a burden, but as a woman still worthy of a seat, a cup of tea, and a place in the world. The days that followed that journey unfolded, not with loud confrontations or dramatic betrayals, but with the quieter, slower cruelty that wears down the spirit little by little, like water dripping on stone, until the shape is altered forever. And in many ways this was worse because it was not sudden, not shocking, but persistent. The kind of treatment that makes you doubt your own worth because the world around you behaves as though you have none. When we arrived at our destination, I had thought perhaps my son would notice that I was not with them during the ride, that he would ask where I had been, that some small flicker of concern might show on his face, but instead, he simply gathered his children, adjusted his jacket, and walked forward without once looking behind, leaving me to shuffle out of the first-class carriage and follow at a distance, my feet aching, my pride bruised, and my heart strangely heavy with the knowledge that what had felt extraordinary to me, the kindness of the conductor, was entirely invisible to the people whose regard I needed most. I carried my own bag, light though it was, and each step reminded me that I was no longer a figure at the center of my family, but a shadow trailing behind them, expected to keep up, but never considered important enough to slow the pace for. My daughter-in-law pulled the children along, her voice bright and clipped, rehearsed for public settings, and I could see how polished they all looked together. A neat little unit, coordinated coats, tidy shoes, the picture of a modern family, while I lagged in my older wool coat with its slightly frayed cuffs, an addition that spoiled the composition. I noticed how carefully she positioned herself in photographs, how often she steered the children to her side, leaving me to hover on the edge of the frame. And when later I saw the pictures posted online, I realized that I had been cropped out, entirely in more than one, as if my existence were a blemish to be retouched. It was not spoken aloud. No one said, "You don't belong." But the silence said it for them, the quiet excisions that told me I was being reduced, not by accident, but by design. At meals, I found myself seated at the far end of the table, next to the children, as though I were one of them needing supervision, rather than one of the adults who had once supervised everyone. When I tried to speak, to tell a story from the past, the kind that used to bring laughter or curiosity, I noticed the glances exchanged across the table, the subtle clearing of throats, the way my words were allowed to trail into air without response until conversation resumed around me as though I had not spoken at all. I began to measure my sentences more carefully, trimming them shorter, choosing silence over the risk of being ignored. And in doing so, I felt myself shrinking even further, becoming what they seemed to want. Background noise. Someone present, but not participating. It is a strange thing to realize that the people you love would rather you be invisible than inconvenient, and strangers still to comply, because defiance feels too exhausting when every attempt at it is swallowed by indifference. The children, of course, mirrored what they saw. Once when I reached for the arm of the sofa to steady myself as I sat down, my grandson laughed and said, "Grandma sits like a turtle." And though he was only 7 and could not possibly understand the sting of those words, my son did not correct him, did not teach him respect, did not remind him that the woman he mocked was the same one who had once rocked him to sleep in her arms. Instead, he smiled faintly, distracted, and let the remark pass. And in that small omission, I understood more clearly than ever how deeply the pattern had set in. If a child sees an adult treat someone as less, they will learn to treat them as less too. And so the cycle of diminishment continues until the person at its center begins to doubt whether they deserve anything more. I noticed, too, the way practical matters were handled. When tickets were purchased for outings, I was always given the seat on the aisle, the one least comfortable, the one most likely to be bumped, as though my preference did not matter. When food was ordered, my choices were never asked, only assumed, as if an elderly woman could not possibly have tastes of her own. When plans were made, I was informed rather than consulted, told where to be and when, like a piece of luggage to be carried along. None of these actions were cruel on their own. Each one could be excused, explained away, dismissed as nothing. But together they created a steady erosion, a slow grinding down of self, until I could almost believe that I had no right to expect anything different. The first escalation was not a single moment, but a series of silences, of small erasures, of glances that slid past me as though I were already fading from the world. It was in the way my son's voice grew more clipped when addressing me, his patience thinner, his attention elsewhere, as if the effort of acknowledging me were too costly. It was in the way my daughter-in-law avoided eye contact, smiling only when others were around to witness it, and in the way she seemed to carry a quiet triumph each time I was made smaller, as though my shrinking validated her place. It was in the way even I began to question whether perhaps I should sit on the floor, whether perhaps I should stay silent, whether perhaps invisibility was easier for everyone, even for me. But beneath all that compliance, a seed had been planted by the conductor's hand on my arm, by that brief journey in the first-class carriage, by the tea that had warmed my fingers. That moment lingered in me like a secret ember, a reminder that another way of being was possible, that I had once been seen, even if only for a moment, and that memory grew sharper each time I was diminished again. I found myself replaying it at night, lying awake in the narrow guest bed, the murmur of voices down the hall drifting toward me, and I would close my eyes and remember the firmness of the seat, the steadiness of the conductor's gaze, the quiet certainty that I was worthy of respect. Against the backdrop of my son's indifference, that memory became both comfort and torment, for it showed me what I was missing, but it also showed me that it was real, not imagined, and that meant I could not go on pretending otherwise. And so the escalation was not loud, but relentless, not violent, but suffocating, a daily accumulation of slights that confirmed what the station floor had already suggested. In their eyes, I was not a mother, not a woman, not even a person of consequence, but a burden to be managed, a problem to be minimized. And yet, quietly, inside me, something was beginning to resist, though I did not yet know how to name it, only that each new indignity made the ember glow a little brighter, threatening one day to ignite. It was not a sudden rebellion, not a loud declaration that broke the pattern, but something far quieter and more private. The kind of shift that begins in the smallest of gestures, yet changes everything, because it introduces the possibility of choice. Where before there was only resignation. And for me, it came one morning when I awoke earlier than the rest of the household and sat by the window, the pale light of dawn leaking through the thin curtains, and I allowed myself to remember not just the pain of being dismissed, but the warmth of being seen. I thought of the conductor again, how effortlessly he had restored my dignity by offering me a seat that matched my humanity rather than my supposed usefulness. And I realized that though he had done nothing extraordinary by the standards of kindness, for me it had been revolutionary, because it reminded me that I had the right to expect more than scraps of attention. That thought, so simple and yet so radical in its implications, was the first time in years that I had considered myself as someone with agency, rather than as someone to be managed by others. I did not leap into confrontation. I was too weary, too accustomed to swallowing my words, but I began with something subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. When breakfast was laid out and the children clamored for toast and fruit, I chose the seat I wanted at the table instead of waiting to be directed. And though my daughter-in-law shot me a brief look, she said nothing, and my son was too distracted with his phone to notice. It was a small thing, almost petty. But as I sat in that chair and spread butter across a piece of bread, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, a reminder that I still had the ability to place myself where I wished. Later that day, when the family prepared to leave for an outing, I told them I would not be joining, that I wanted to take a walk alone, and though there was an awkward silence, my son only shrugged, perhaps relieved not to have to shepherd me along. And so I went out by myself, down unfamiliar streets, my steps slow but determined, and I breathed air that was not filled with their voices. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free. That walk was nothing special to anyone else. It was only an old woman wandering through a neighborhood, pausing to look in shop windows, resting on a bench near a fountain, buying herself a small pastry with her own money. But to me, it was a reclamation, a statement to myself that I still existed independently of them, that I could move through the world without their permission. I savored that pastry, as though it were a feast, not for its taste, though it was sweet and flaky, but because it was chosen and purchased by me, for me, without anyone else's judgment or control. And as I sat there, crumbs on my lap, the fountain gurgling beside me, I realized that I was not powerless, that invisibility was not an absolute fate, but something imposed that I could, at least sometimes, refuse to accept. When I returned later, the house was full of noise, the children loud with excitement from their outing, my daughter-in-law busy in the kitchen, my son recounting some detail of traffic or prices, and none of them asked where I had been or how I had spent my time. At first this stung. Was I so unimportant that even my absence went unnoticed? But then I felt a kind of strange relief, because their indifference also meant I could carve out spaces for myself without interference. If they did not care enough to monitor me, then I was free to create a secret life within the cracks of their neglect, a life where I belonged to myself again. That evening, as I lay in bed, I thought about how easily I had accepted their narrative, how readily I had allowed myself to be treated as though I were nothing but an extra piece of luggage. The conductor's gesture had unsettled me because it had revealed how false that narrative was, how unnecessary, how cruel, and my solitary walk had confirmed that I could still act on my own behalf. It was not grand, it was not dramatic, but it was mine. And the quiet ownership of that decision filled me with a kind of hope I had not felt in years. The midpoint of my story was not a victory to be celebrated with trumpets. It was a shift so modest that from the outside it might have seemed meaningless, but inside, it was the moment I stopped waiting for them to notice me, to seat me, to ask me, and began instead to choose small acts that reminded me I was still alive, still thinking, still capable of moving through the world as a person rather than a shadow. And though it did not end my pain, it changed its shape. For now it was laced with a new thread of defiance, thin but resilient. And I sensed, though I did not yet fully believe, that this thread might one day weave itself into something stronger, something unbreakable. If the first shift had been that quiet act of walking out alone, of claiming space for myself in the midst of their indifference, the second escalation came when the past reached out its hand to press against the fragile boundary I had begun to build, testing whether I had truly changed or whether I would still bend under the old weight of obligation. And it began, as these things often do, not with my son, but with the children, whose words, innocent in their intention, cut me more deeply than I expected, because they reflected the way they had learned to see me through their parents' eyes. One evening, after dinner, my grandson looked up at me and asked why the man in the blue uniform had taken me to a different part of the train, his tone curious but faintly mocking, as though it were a joke to be repeated. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law laughed lightly and said, "Grandma likes to sit with strangers, don't you?" The children laughed too, and though the sound was bright and harmless to them, it rang in me like a bell of humiliation, because it told me that what had been a moment of rescue for me had already been twisted into a story of oddness, of embarrassment, of something to be laughed at rather than honored. My son did not correct them, did not even notice the sharpness of my silence. He only continued clearing plates, leaving me to swallow the ache and pretend that it was nothing. It was then I understood that invisibility was not enough for them. I was not only to be ignored, but also diminished, turned into an anecdote that justified their neglect. And once that realization took root, I began to see the pattern everywhere. When neighbors visited and asked how I was enjoying the trip, my daughter-in-law would answer for me, her voice sugary, saying, "She's managing," as if I were some fragile artifact that required constant oversight. When my son spoke to colleagues on the phone, I overheard him joke about how Mom gets confused with schedules, though I had been the one who remembered the departure time when he nearly missed it. Even in the smallest details, my competence was erased, rewritten into frailty, until I felt as though the person I truly was had been replaced by the caricature they needed me to be. Weak, dependent, slightly foolish. The escalation was not only social, but also practical, for I began to notice that my contributions, however modest, were quietly absorbed without acknowledgement, while my presence was treated as an inconvenience. I paid for groceries once, slipping a few bills onto the counter when my daughter-in-law realized she had forgotten her wallet, and she accepted them without thanks, later telling the children, "We're lucky Daddy takes care of everything." I folded laundry while they were out, thinking I was being helpful, only to hear her complain that I had mixed the children's socks incorrectly, as though my effort were not only unneeded, but disruptive. Each attempt at usefulness was met with dismissal, each attempt at conversation with interruption, until it seemed that no matter what I did, it was either invisible or wrong. And yet, what pained me most was not their dismissal, but the growing awareness that I had allowed it, that I had spent years smoothing over their indifference with excuses, telling myself they were busy, they were stressed, they meant no harm, when, in truth, their behavior revealed not temporary distraction, but a settled habit of disregard. The conductor's hand on my arm had pulled back a veil, and now I could not help but see clearly what had always been there. A son who no longer valued his mother except as an accessory to his image. A daughter-in-law who saw me as competition for space and influence. Grandchildren being raised to view me as a curiosity rather than a source of love. The pressure built further when letters began to arrive, not from strangers, but from family left behind. One was from my eldest granddaughter, who had always been gentler with me than the rest, asking where I was, why I had not returned calls, whether I was safe. Her words carried genuine concern, but they also carried the unspoken weight of the family's narrative, for she mentioned how everyone is worried and how my son and his wife don't know what happened. Reading those lines, I felt the twist of irony, so sharp it nearly made me laugh aloud, because I knew exactly what had happened. They had happened. They had happened to me in every look, every silence, every command to sit down and stay out of the way. And now they painted themselves as victims of my absence, rewriting the story so that my retreat became abandonment, their neglect transformed into my betrayal. Another letter followed, this one not gentle but laced with accusation, written by my son himself. The words were neat, deliberate, but hard, accusing me of making things difficult, of being ungrateful, of embarrassing him in front of others. He claimed that I was too sensitive, that I misinterpreted ordinary family dynamics as cruelty, and he warned me, with the cold detachment of someone scolding an employee, that if I could not adapt, perhaps it would be better if I stayed elsewhere. For a while, reading it, I felt my chest tighten, not only from the words themselves, but from the realization that he had written them without hesitation, without any flicker of awareness of their brutality. To him, it was not even cruelty, it was simply truth. The truth as he had constructed it, a truth in which his mother was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. That letter was the true escalation, more than the laughter, more than the dismissals, because it was written, recorded, deliberate. Spoken words could be denied, forgotten, excused, but ink on paper could not. It was proof of how he saw me. And though part of me longed to write back, to defend myself, to remind him of every sacrifice I had made, I resisted, because I knew now that his blindness was not ignorance, but choice. and no argument could change what he had chosen not to see. Instead, I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand, where it sat like a wound that never healed, a reminder that my invisibility was not an accident, but a verdict. Still, even as I was being pressed down, some stubborn part of me began to rise. I started to imagine what it would mean to live differently, to claim space outside their orbit, to carve a life not defined by waiting for their acknowledgement. The thought frightened me because I had spent so many years revolving around their needs that the idea of stepping away felt almost like sacrilege, as though I were betraying some sacred duty. But the more they erased me, the more the ember inside me glowed until it became impossible to ignore. I knew the escalation would not stop with letters or laughter. It would grow, as such things always do, until I either surrendered entirely or broke away. And in that knowledge lay the paradox. Their attempt to reduce me further was the very thing that prepared me to resist. For in trying to silence me completely, they reminded me that I still had a voice, faint though it was, and that I could still choose to use it. The second escalation, then, was not merely their cruelty, but my awakening to it. The recognition that what they called love was in truth control, what they called care was in truth dismissal, and what they called family was in truth a cage. That recognition was unbearable, but it was also necessary, because once you see the bars of the cage, you can no longer convince yourself you are free. The breaking point did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors, for by then my voice had been trained into quietness, and theirs into indifference, but rather with a decision that grew inside me like a slow storm, forming silently over weeks until it finally gathered enough weight to release itself in action. And when it did, it came not with drama, but with a clarity so cold and steady that I almost frightened myself, because I knew there would be no turning back, no chance to fold myself once again into their expectations. The letters, the laughter, the endless small humiliations had accumulated into a mountain I could no longer climb, and one evening, sitting at the small desk in the room they had given me, the one furnished with the kind of indifference reserved for temporary guests, I pulled out a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery I had been saving for years and began to write with the steadiness of someone who has finally accepted her own truth. I did not write to plead or to beg or to explain, for I owed them no explanations anymore, and I did not write to accuse either, for accusation still assumes the other cares enough to be wounded, and I no longer believed they did. Instead, I wrote, with finality, a tone so unlike the careful conciliations of the past that even my own handwriting seemed altered, stronger, sharper, each letter pressed firmly into the paper. To my son, I wrote, "You told me to sit on the floor, and I did, because obedience was the only language we had left between us, but I will not sit there any more." I did not list the sacrifices, the years of work, the sleepless nights, the money I had given, the loyalty I had poured. I knew he already remembered those things, even if he chose to bury them. I kept the letter short, 3 lines only. You asked me to sit on the floor. I have chosen a chair instead. I am not angry, but I am finished. That was all, and it was enough, because what mattered was not that he understood, but that I declared it for myself. And the act of setting those words on paper felt like sliding a key into a lock I had forgotten I held. I wrote a second letter, this one addressed not to him, but to the lawyer he had once sent to question me about my health and my supposed confusion. a man who had looked at me as though I were a fragile object to be catalogued and secured for the benefit of others. To him I wrote with legal precision, stating that I was of sound mind, living by my own choice, and that any further interference under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I signed my full name, carefully, proudly, each letter of it a reclamation of identity, and when I placed the pen down, I felt a calmness so deep it was almost physical, as though my lungs could finally expand fully after years of shallow breathing. The next morning, I walked to the post office, the letters tucked neatly in my handbag, and the air outside was sharp with early spring, carrying the scent of damp earth and budding leaves, and with each step, I felt a strange lightness, as though I were walking away not just from a house, but from decades of silence. I mailed the envelopes without hesitation, watching the clerk stamp them, and when they slid from my hand into the outgoing bin, I felt the finality of a door shutting behind me, firm and irreversible. That night, when my son asked me to help fold laundry and I quietly refused, something in my voice made him look at me differently, not with respect, perhaps, but with a flicker of recognition that something had changed. He asked if I was feeling well, and I smiled, not cruelly, but firmly, and told him I was feeling better than I had in years. He did not press, and in that silence, I understood that he sensed the shift even if he could not name it. For the first time in our relationship, the balance of power had tilted, not because he had given it to me, but because I had taken it back by refusing to play my role any longer. In the following days, I moved through the house with a different posture, quieter but straighter, carrying myself not as someone waiting for instructions, but as someone making choices. I ate when I wanted, I walked when I wanted, and when asked questions meant to dismiss or control, I responded with silence or with simple truth, never with apology. And though these actions might have seemed small to anyone else, to me they were revolutionary, because each one was a refusal to return to the floor. The culmination of all of this came not in their reaction, which was predictably muted, but in my own sense of completion. For when you have lived long enough being told what you are and what you are not, there is nothing more powerful than saying to yourself, I decide. I had thought for years that reclaiming dignity would require their recognition, their apology, their change of heart. But I understood now that dignity is not granted by others. It is seized by the self, and once taken, it cannot be returned unless you hand it over. I would not hand it over again. The climax of my story, then, was not a confrontation, but an act of writing, an act of mailing, an act of standing in the quiet certainty of my own worth. And though it did not alter the past or transform my son into someone different, it transformed me. And that was the only transformation that mattered. For the first time in decades, I felt the floor beneath me not as a place I had been pushed down to, but as solid ground from which I could rise, and I knew with a clarity so sharp it bordered on joy that I would never be asked to sit on the floor again without answering, firmly and without hesitation. No, the resolution did not arrive as a celebration, or even as an announcement, for there was no audience to applaud and no family to congratulate me for finally stepping into my own strength, but rather as a calmness that settled slowly, like a soft rain. After a long storm, and in that calmness, I discovered something more enduring than triumph, something quieter and steadier, the sense of belonging to myself again after so many years of belonging only to others. I had mailed the letters. I had spoken my refusals, and though the world outside continued with its noise and demands, inside me there was silence. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of peace. And I found that I no longer cared whether my son called or whether my daughter-in-law frowned or whether the children laughed at some story they half remembered, because my worth no longer depended on their acknowledgement. Each morning, I awoke and brewed my own tea, sitting by the window that overlooked the station tracks, and instead of flinching when the trains roared past, I listened with a kind of reverence, hearing in each whistle not a reminder of humiliation, but a promise of possibility, because those trains carried people who were moving, leaving, arriving, beginning again, and I realized that I was one of them, even if I never boarded another carriage. In the stillness of my new life, I began to notice small details that once I had overlooked. The way light shifted across the kitchen table at different hours, the sound of rain ticking against the glass like a language I had forgotten, the weight of a book resting in my lap as though it had chosen me rather than the other way around. These details became companions, not substitutes for people, but reminders that existence itself could be enough, that I did not need validation from the very voices that had silenced me. Sometimes, when loneliness crept close, I allowed myself to remember the conductor's hand, the firmness of his gesture, and I held on to that memory not with longing, but with gratitude, because it had shown me that kindness still existed in the world, even from strangers, and that was enough to believe that I could also be kind to myself. There were letters that followed, of course, some softer than the first, attempts at reconciliation written in the stilted language of people who did not understand what had truly broken. But I did not answer them, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed to. To respond would have been to step back into the old dance of justification and appeasement, and I was done with dances choreographed by others. I kept one letter from my eldest grandchild, folded carefully in the drawer of my desk, because it was written not with accusation, but with love. And in it I saw a glimmer of hope that not all connections had to be severed, that perhaps one day, on my terms, there could be a visit, a conversation, a renewal, but I did not hurry toward it. For now, it was enough to know that love was still possible, even if it lived in the distance, waiting patiently until I was ready. What I found most surprising was not the absence of my family, but the absence of fear once they were gone. I had believed for so long that I could not live without their approval, that their neglect was better than their absence. But once I chose absence, once I stepped fully into it, I discovered that solitude could be generous, that it could hold me without judgment, that it could give me room to breathe in ways their company never had. I filled my days with simple routines, reading, walking, cooking meals just for myself, and though to others these might have seemed meager, to me they were luxuries, because they belonged to me alone. The resolution, then, was not a dramatic reunion or a sudden reversal of fortune, but a steady acceptance that I had reclaimed my life, and that reclaiming it was enough. I no longer sat waiting for someone to notice me, to save me, to lift me from the floor, because I had learned to rise on my own. And in rising, I discovered that the world did not collapse without their voices, that in fact it became clearer, more spacious, more mine. If another woman, somewhere, finds herself seated on the cold floor of a station, told by her own blood to wait quietly, to accept invisibility, I would tell her this: you do not have to stay there. You do not have to wait. you do not have to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it. Stand, even if your knees ache, even if your heart trembles. Stand and choose the seat that belongs to you, because it is there, waiting, and no one can deny it once you claim it. That is what I learned, and it is enough to carry me forward into the quiet years that remain, not as someone's afterthought, not as a burden to be shifted, but as a woman who finally remembered that she has always been her own beginning and her own end.